Welcome, everyone. This is the fifth open seminar offered by our Princeton Bern Research Initiative, Interactive Histories, Co-Produced Communities, in which we attempt to explore moments of what we call religious co-production in the intertwined histories of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And our hope is to understand better how these three religious traditions have continuously formed, reformed, and transformed by interacting with and thinking about one another. But this time is also a premiere, as it is the first time that one of our academic collegium members will present his research related to this idea of co-production. And so we are very glad to have Professor Israel Yuval from Jerusalem talking about the sacrifice of Isaac and Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And I pass on to David Nierenberg in Princeton, who will introduce Israel.
Well, as you all know, who have been to these before, our introductions are always very short. This makes it very difficult for me because but first, I've known Israel Yuval for a long time, and I think all of us have learned from him for a very long time. He has done many, many things. He has built great institutions. Germania Judaica is a project that all of us have benefited from, and that he, and along with others, Alfred Haverkamp of blessed memory and others, built together. He built Scolion in the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, one of the world's most interesting and creative interdisciplinary centers. And he has taught us all how to think together through that institution and others. But we're really here because of his how he's taught us to think about the three religions. He's given us a book called Two Nations in Your Womb, which I think today will teach us he could just as well have called Three Nations in Your Womb, if he had chosen to dedicate his attention in that book to Islam as well. And really from the very beginning, I think it was exactly 30 years ago, in 1993, I shouldn't say that's the very beginning, that's not the very beginning of Israel Yuval's scholarship, but it was the publication in 1993 was it Zion, of an article about the Akedah, about the binding of Isaac and its relationship to the emergence of blood libel accusations against the Jews, that one could say a certain form of thinking about co-production really exploded onto the scene of Jewish Christian history. And so I think it's really very fitting that now, in exactly 30 years later, Professor Yuval is going to return to the topic, I'm sure in an equally explosive and fruitful way, this time including on Islam as well. I wanted to say much more about, for example, how Israel Yuval is now thinking about the history of the possible, how he's trying to teach us to excavate potentials that may long have been suppressed, forgotten, or perhaps never existed, but that are good to think with in our sources. But I don't need to say any of that because we're going to witness it right now. Maureen will moderate the questions. Maureen Atali will moderate the questions after the lecture. And we have 90 minutes together today. And I know every second of those 90 minutes will be worth the heartbeats. So welcome, and welcome, Professor Yuval.
Here I am. Do you hear me? Okay, thank you, David. It is written in the Talmud that when you praise a person in his presence, you should tell only a few of his virtues, not all of them. One reason may be that the listener might believe what he hears. Another possible reason is to prevent him to blush with shame. David, although you didn't follow this rule, I thank you for your kind words. Fortunately, we are speaking on Zoom, so you couldn't see me blushing. I take this opportunity to thank you, David, and Katharina Hayden, for your initiative to bring together scholars from all over the world to discuss important and sometimes sensitive historical issues that have relevance to the cultural and religious identity of more than 2 billion people all over the world. My lecture also touches on sensitive points in the relations between the three religions. At this very hour, as we gather here on Zoom to discuss sensitive issues from the distant past, tens of thousands of Israelis demonstrate in Jerusalem, close to where I live, in front of the Knesset against the intention to bring about a constitutional revolution and destroy the democratic and liberal character of the State of Israel. A dream of generations is facing destruction. My heart and conscience are with the protesters, and I offer them my sympathy. I open my lecture with Marc Bloch, the great French historian who was one of the founders of the Annales, joined the resistance, fought against the Nazis, and was executed by the Gestapo shortly, a few days before the liberation of France. He is a model of an intellectual for whom history is not only a profession, but also a moral commitment. And now to the lecture itself. Marc Bloch argued that history only examines what has been preserved. Accordingly, historians prioritize a meticulous examinations of sources, evaluating their credibility and carefully interpreting the voices they reveal. While I hold these traditional research methods in high regard, I also support a history that raises suggestions about what might have happened. I call this the history of the possible, or what Natalie Davis in her book, The Return of Martin called possible history. By also exploring what has not survived, historians can enrich our understanding of the past. To do this, I aim to introduce a literary approach that historians should consider, even though it produces speculative outcomes. Now, the term speculative might arouse reservations. It can remind of Theodor Zeldin's claim for the liberties of what he called the creative artist, or of Simon Schama's book, Dead Certainties, Unwarranted Speculations, a book that faced criticism for its lack of differentiation between historical facts and fictional details. The reader learns of this distinction only in the afterword of the book, and the absence of footnotes make it impossible to verify the accuracy of the information presented. Gertrude Himmelfarb argued that while Schama may not see himself as a postmodernist, his book embodies the worst fears of postmodernism skeptics concerning the pursuit of historical truth. Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi's Freud's Moses also belong to this genre. Its final chapter begins with a quote from Job 32. I must speak so that I find relief, which serves as a justification for an imagined monologue that Yerushalmi leads with Freud. Another example, perhaps more relevant to this audience, is Eliyahu Astor Strauss' The Jews in Muslim Spain. This book showcases the author's erudition interspersed with imaginative passages such as invented conversations and events that Astor created from his imaginative mind. As students in the 1970s at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and Ora might remember it well, where Astor Strauss taught, we found the book to be both amusing and charming, due also to the author's eccentric personality. However, my methodology should not be mistaken as a revival of speculative historical writing. I suggest using existing sources to uncover lost texts. While it may seem impossible to restore something that no longer exists, there are instances where an event was documented orally or in writing, only to be later suppressed by a competitive narrative. The winning story may not completely erase all evidence of the muted story, but rather reuse parts of it as building blocks. At times, these remnants are even revealed through haphazard editing or oversight. When traces of a muted story remain, it may be possible to suggestively reconstruct it. To do so, the historian must employ subversive tactics, critically examine the dominant narrative, exercise skepticism, and employ imagination. It may be advantageous to first adopt a literary mindset before proceeding with the historical research. Stories and counter stories are indeed constantly present in our daily lives, from quarrels between children to media reports, political discourse, and historical records. European colonialism in America silenced the stories of the indigenous population, while the official Turkish alternative denies the account of the Armenian genocide. Similarly, the narrative of the independence of the State of Israel overlooks the Palestinian Nakba. This phenomenon can also be seen in ancient literature. The biblical story of the flood overshadowed pagan Babylonian tales, and the story of the Exodus was met with a hostile response in Hellenistic Egypt. The potential of such restorations could be enormous, offering insight into previously unheard voices of minorities, women, dissidents, and marginalized individuals, such as archaeologists can reconstruct a complete house using only a few remnants. Historians can similarly piece together lost narratives using scraps of text and story. When the restoration of a silenced narrative passes the test of reasonability, it should be accepted as a legitimate part of historical discourse, like historical interpretations that are considered reasonable hypotheses, even though they also remain speculative. The history of the possible deserves the same recognition. The idea of counter-history is not unknown among historians. It is often used to describe a minority's rhetorical approach that challenges a dominant majority narrative. Historian Amos Funkenstein applied this concept to the study of Jewish history by presenting Toldot Yeshu as a counter-history to the Gospels. The main story, namely the Gospel, is seen as representing the power of the dominant group, while the Jewish counter-story represents the voice of the weaker minority group. This perspective suggests that counter-stories arise in response to dominant narratives and come after the main story has been established. However, consider a scenario where in a distant future, the New Testament has been completely lost, and only the Jewish hostile biography of Jesus, Toldot Yeshu, remains. In such a situation, wouldn't it be the responsibility of future historians to piece together the Christian gospel from Toldot Yeshu? This approach is akin to the technique in the past of using negatives to develop photographs that depict reality. I suggest reading historical records like negatives of a picture. My definition of a counter-narrative diverges from the common understanding of it as a minority rhetorical strategy. I believe that every story, even a dominant one, is inherently a counter-narrative. This is because every story pits its own version against another version and leaves out certain facets to establish its own narrative. In essence, every victorious story is built upon the remains of a defeated narrative. Life experience reinforces this observation as we see that there is no singular, unopposed story. Recently, I have been embarking on an adventurous journey to uncover the hidden narratives within the book of Genesis. And it is in this pursuit that I came across the story of the Akedah in the Quran. I am not a Quran scholar and I lack proficiency in Arabic. So I can kindly request the understanding and consideration of experts in Arabic literature. This lecture is a literary exercise, an experiment that aims to address historical topics. I will begin by exploring the original biblical story of the binding of Isaac in Genesis 22, comparing it to the story of the expulsion of Ishmael in Genesis 21. Then I will discuss various Christian and Jewish interpretations of the binding of Isaac before reaching the enigmatic depiction of the event in the Quran, where the identity of the bound son is left undisclosed. Utilizing the concept of counter-history, I will put forward the argument that the Quranic story is reflecting suppressed narratives from the Hebrew Bible. The story of the binding of Isaac and its subsequent interpretations have had a significant impact on the religious identities of Jews, Christians, and Muslims. The intersection of literature, history, and politics in this story raises important questions, such as the identity of the beloved son, the ownership of the Temple Mount or Haram al-Sharif, and the promise of the Holy Land. When religion and politics are intertwined, it is essential for historians to delve into the wide range of narratives that shape identities. Although these narratives may have contributed to conflicts in the past, we can work together promoting reconciliation in the future by examining and understanding the diverse perspectives they offer. The story of the binding of Isaac opens with God testing Abraham's faith by commanding him to sacrifice his son Isaac. The well-known title Akedat Yitzhak in Hebrew, meaning the binding of Isaac, is misleading because the central figure of the biblical narrative is Abraham, tested by God, not Isaac. The ultimate religious and political lesson of the story is revealed in its conclusion, where God tells Abraham, I quote, "Because you have done this and have not withheld your only son, I will bless you and make your offspring as numerous as the stars in the sky. Your offspring shall possess the cities of their enemies." By demonstrating his willingness to sacrifice his son Isaac, Abraham favored him over the elder son Ishmael. As in other stories in Genesis, the chosen son, not the firstborn, gains the birthright. The documentary hypothesis explains that verses from the Jahavist, the so-called J source, were added to the original Elohist, E source, to give the story a secondary purpose of linking the location of the binding on Mount of Moriah, Har HaMoriah, with the location of the temple in Jerusalem. The early E layer emphasized the election of the chosen son, while the later J layer focuses on the selection of this future holy place. The political motive in Genesis 22 to portray Isaac as the chosen son aligns with the events in the previous chapter, 21, where Ishmael and his mother Hagar are sent to the desert. This results in Isaac becoming the sole remaining son and being deemed the chosen one. Ishmael is the rival, the competing son who was rejected. Biblical scholars have recently emphasized the remarkable similarity between the two stories. Both involve a father who is ready to kill his son with the consent or command of God. In both stories, the reader is left with the impression that the child's death is inevitable. Abraham's response in both instances is immediate and unwavering. In Genesis 21, Abraham, I quote, rose early in the morning, took bread and a cup of water, gave it to Hagar, placed it on her shoulder with the child, and sent her away. Similarly, in Genesis 22, Abraham, I quote, rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took his two young men with him and his son Isaac. Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on his son Isaac. The main motifs of the two stories are also similar, including traveling into a distant, unknown location, the child's life being threatened, the appearance of an angel who saves the child, and the sudden rescue. In Genesis 21, God says to the mother, hold him fast with your hand. While in Genesis 22, God says, do not lay your hand on the boy. Seeing is also a significant motif in both stories, with God opening Hagar's eyes in Genesis 21 and Abraham lifting his eyes in Genesis 22. In Genesis 22, Abraham calls the place the Lord will see, as it is said to this day, on the mount of the Lord it shall be seen. In Hebrew, the name Mount Moriah rings similar to lirot, to see, indicating a location where God's presence can be witnessed. Finally, both stories conclude with a marriage. Ishmael marries an Egyptian woman from the south. Isaac marries Rebekah from Aram Naharaim in the north. How to explain these similarities in the art of storytelling? Why tell a similar story about a rival? These similarities can be explained by the literary forma of history and counterhistory. I'm suggesting that the biblical author was aware of an alternative version that portrayed Ishmael as the chosen son and sought to refute it by creating two parallel stories, one positive and one negative. The positive story, which was the author's preferred version, was about Isaac, and the negative story was about Ishmael, portraying him as the son of a slave woman and a wild man who was banished to the wilderness. The biblical narrator could have ignored the counter story entirely, but instead he chooses to destroy it from within by using elements of the counter story and portraying them in a negative light. He does so because the opposite story is present and threatening. The voice of the vanquished is also heard, however, in a negative context. This suggests that the defeated negative story was once a positive story that represented a different perspective from that of the Bible's editors. Who can be the people who had an interest in telling such a story? There were evidently people who rejected the alleged divine promise given to the descendants of Isaac, to the Israelites, to inherit the land. They could have been the indigenous inhabitants of the land of Canaan or the inhabitants of the countries bordering the land. Their story, with Isaac being portrayed as hostile, as Ishmael as positive, being positive, was reversed in the Bible. The tension between the two stories in Genesis 21 and 22 is also reflected in the meaning of the names Yishmael and Isaac, Yitzchak. The name Isaac, Yitzchak, mean in Hebrew will laugh or will play, while the name Yishmael means God will hear. As described in Genesis 21, when Isaac was weaned, Sarah saw Ishmael laughing, metzachek, or playing with Isaac, and that's what made her want to get rid of him. The Hebrew word tzachak has also a sexual connotation, suggesting that Ishmael initiated perhaps homosexual relations with Isaac. Thus, the biblical story portrays Ishmael in a negative light, which aligns more with the meaning of Isaac's name, not Ishmael. This is a clear example of a counter-narrative. The suppressed story told by Ishmael's followers held probably a contrary viewpoint, depicting Isaac as the one who was laughing, that is, committed sexual misdeeds. As is typical in counter-narratives, the biblical narrator did not refute the facts, but instead challenged their interpretation and attributed the sexual reference to Ishmael, despite the positive connotation of his name. This highlights the difference between the two accounts. Ishmael's followers believed that Isaac had sinned through prohibited sexuality, and this is the name, Yitzchak, while they saw Ishmael as God's beloved, whose voice was literally heard by God, Shamael. This literary reading can echo a historical reality. As mentioned, the two stories reflect a contest over the land of Israel, with the Torah representing the perspective of the Israelites. The biblical stories may have been intended to provide justification for the Israelite occupation of the land and to establish their claim of ownership. The tension between domination and slavery is indeed a recurring theme in these stories, and the way the two sons are portrayed can be seen as reflecting different perspectives on this theme. So far, Genesis. Surprisingly, the story of the Akedah has only one implicit allusion in the whole biblical literature. First Chronicles chapter 21 recounts how King David purchased the threshing floor from a man named Ornan the Jebusite in Jerusalem and built an altar on it. This story shares many similarities with the binding of Isaac and serves as a political statement representing King David as a second Abraham. It seeks to reinforce the sanctity of the temple in Jerusalem and glorify the Davidic dynasty against internal opposition, possibly from the Samaritans who did not recognize the sanctity of the temple in Jerusalem. The story aims to silence any competing claims and counter narratives. Once again, by closely examining this story, the voices of an internal opposition can be restored. I have addressed this in an article published already 15 years ago and will not go over it here again. Before pursuing further reconstructions, It is now important to examine the interpretations of the Akedah in early Christian and rabbinic literature. Both Christianity and rabbinic Judaism saw the biblical preference of Isaac over Ishmael as a matter of religious significance rather than a political national one. In Hebrews, Epistle to the Hebrews, chapter 11, the story serves as evidence of Abraham's faith in the resurrection of the dead, as he saw no contradiction between God's promise to have descendants through Isaac and his command to sacrifice him. In the New Testament, there is no direct comparison between Isaac and Jesus, as Isaac did not die. However, Melita of Sardis in the second half of the 2nd century made partial analogies between the two, such as the parallel between Isaac carrying the wood for the sacrifice and Jesus carrying the cross, and the motifs of the 3 days with Abraham and Isaac traveling to the binding site and Jesus spending 3 days between crucifixion and resurrection. A pre-Christian tradition found in the Book of Jubilees dated the Akedah in the Passover holiday. This dating helped early Christianity draw an analogy between Jesus' crucifixion, the Passover lamb, Agnus Dei, and the sacrifice of Isaac. The Christian transformation of the Akedah into a model of the crucifixion challenged rabbinic Judaism. Some rabbis also believed that the binding of Isaac took place on Passover. A 2nd century Midrash states that the blood seen by God on the doors of the Israelites' house in Egypt, which saved them from the firstborn scourge, was not only the blood of the sacrificial lamb, but also the blood of Isaac, of the binding of Isaac. A later tradition discussed lengthily by Shalom Spiegel in his famous book states that Abraham, against the angel's command, ultimately sacrificed Isaac, slaughtered him, and shed his blood. Isaac was then revived by dew. This legend made Isaac a type of Jewish counter-Jesus. The timing of the binding of Isaac during Passover, which, as we heard, was advantageous for Christianity, as Isaac was seen as prototype of Jesus, may have disturbed some Talmudic scholars, resulting in an alternative tradition that dates Isaac's binding on Rosh Hashanah rather than Passover. This dating had impact on Rosh Hashanah in 3 ways. First, it transformed the significance of the blowing of the shofar on Rosh Hashanah. The Bible saw it as a solemn acknowledgement of God's kingship, while in rabbinic literature it became reminiscent of the sacrificed ram that substituted Isaac. Second, it made the sacrifice of Isaac a redemptive event. In Rosh Hashanah liturgy, we find the following supplication, I quote, to God: "Remember how our father Abraham bound his son upon the altar, and how he suppressed his compassion to do your will and with a whole heart. So may your compassion suppress your anger against us, and in your great goodness, turn your fierce anger away from your people, your city, your land, and your inheritance," end quote. The analogy is odd, since Abraham overcame his compassion, while God is asked to overcome his anger. This rabbinic interpretation of the Akedah sought to turn Isaac into an offering to atone for the sins of Israel. Again, the similarity to the atonement of the crucifixion is clear. In the Babylonian Talmud, it is stated that the blowing of the shofar reminds God to remember the binding of Isaac which is considered by him, I quote, as if you had bound yourselves before him, yourself. This phrasing echoes the Christian concept of imitatio Christi, the imitation of Christ. While Christians have Jesus as their model, Jews have Isaac. Third point, the dating of the Haggadah on Rosh Hashanah impacts the Torah reading of the holiday. On the second day of the holiday, the story of the binding of Isaac is read. However, the reading begins with the banishment of Ishmael on the first day of the holiday, with the reading of the banishment. This raised the question of why the reading of the Akedah, which is appropriate for Rosh Hashanah, assuming that this is the date of the Akedah, why this reading includes the preceding story, Genesis 21, the banishment of Ishmael. In my opinion, this demonstrates an early understanding in rabbinic Judaism that the two stories are related to each other, as mentioned previously. The rabbis' awareness of the parallels between Genesis 21 and Genesis 22 bring us closer to the story of the Akedah in the Quran. Spoiler alert. I will argue that the Quran also recognizes these similarities. Now to the Quran. And Maureen, can you present perhaps the text, the Surah 37? The Akedah story in Surah 37 does not specify the name of the son. This ambiguity has led to debates and different interpretations among Quranic scholars. Some believe that the son referred to is Ishmael, while others argue that the Quran supports the biblical account and that the son is Isaac. In the 9th century, Al-Yaqubi notes that there are many traditions and no consensus on the matter. Al-Tabari, writing in the 10th century, presents both sides of the argument, but leans towards Isaac being the bound son. However, by the 10th century, the opinion that the son referred to in the Quran is Ishmael had become dominant among Muslim commentators and is now today widely accepted among Muslims. Only among Shias is a tradition that Isaac was the bound son is maintained. The debate about the identity of the son in the Quran lies in the two proclamations given to Abraham in Surah 37. The first proclamation in verse 101 is in response to Abraham's request from God for a righteous son, with God stating, "So we gave him glad tidings, Bashir, of a gentle son," without mentioning the son's name. After the unnamed son grew up, Abraham had a dream in which he was asked to sacrifice him. The story then unfolds, and at its end, Abraham receives the second proclamation, verse 112, and we gave him glad tidings of Isaac, a prophet from among the righteous. Given the mention of Isaac's name in the second proclamation, it seems logical that the first story pertains to the birth of Ishmael and his sacrifice. According to this interpretation, due to his devotion to God, Abraham was blessed with the birth of another son, Isaac. However, it is also possible to interpret that both proclamations deal with the birth of Isaac. In the first, Abraham was told that his son would be virtuous, and in the second, that he would be a prophet. In this interpretation, the son of the Quranic story of the Akedah is Isaac, not Ishmael. The identity of the sacrificed son is clearly defined for readers in Genesis 22. Take your son, says God, your only son, whom you love, Isaac. However, this understanding is disputed by Muslim readers, as they interpret that your only son refers to Ishmael, who was Abraham's only son prior to the birth of Isaac. Isaac was never Abraham's only son. The words, your only son, may be remnants of an older version of the story that was not fully edited out, in which the sacrificed son was indeed Ishmael, the only son. The sages of the Talmud grappled with these words and created a dialogue between God and Abraham, who tries to evade God's command to sacrifice his son. According to the Talmud, when God instructs Abraham to sacrifice his son, Abraham responds by asking, which son? I have two. God replies, your only son. But Abraham retorts, both are unique to their mother. This invented dialogue shows that even the sages of the Talmud felt that the title your only son was inappropriate for Isaac. This is not the only discrepancy between the two Akedah stories in the Quran and the Bible. The Quran states that Abraham told his son about a dream in which he was commanded to sacrifice him, to which the son replied, do as you are commanded. The Quran does not mention God commanding the sacrifice, and only later says that it was a test. The son's response in the Quran also differs from Isaac's question in Genesis 22, as he asks in Genesis, where is a lamb for the burnt offering? In the Torah, Isaac expresses his astonishment as they go to the place of sacrifice, while in the Quran, the son willingly cooperates with his father. These differences from the biblical story, which holds such importance in Judaism and Christianity, need explanation. I aim to assert that the variations in the Quran version of the Akedah story are influenced by its familiarity with the alternative story of Ishmael's banishment and another story of Hagar's escape as depicted in Genesis 21 and the story of Hagar in Genesis 16. You don't have the text. The Quran recognizes the similarities between these stories and incorporates elements from the story of Ishmael's banishment into its own version of the Akedah. As a result, the attribution of the Akedah story to Isaac becomes blurred. There are 5 points in which the Quranic story of the Akedah shares similarities with Genesis 21 and 16, namely with these two narratives of the expulsion of Ishmael and Hagar's flight, and differs from the biblical story of Ishmael binding in Genesis 22. First, in the Quran, Abraham informs his son of his dream to sacrifice him, while in Genesis 22, it is God who commands Abraham to do so. This aligns more with the story of Ishmael's expulsion, in which Abraham is actively banishing him with God's consent. Second, in the Quranic story, the first announcement to Abraham, in Surah 37, was the birth of a gentle son. This quality of the son deliberately reverses the traits attributed to Ishmael in the story of his banishment, where it is said he will be a man with a wild nature. He will be against everyone, and everyone will be against him. This is Genesis 16. The Quran transformed this negative trait into a positive one. Third, in the Quranic story, Abraham had the dream when his son was reaching adulthood. Similarly, in 3702, similarly in the Torah, Ishmael was banished after Isaac had been raised and weaned. Fourth, In the Quran, there is a correlation between Abraham's agreement to sacrifice his son in the first glad tiding, first Bashir, and the birth of Isaac in the second one. Also in Genesis 21, there is a connection between the banishment of Ishmael and the birth of Isaac, but in reverse order. The birth of Isaac raised Sarah's jealousy and eventually led to Ishmael's banishment. Fifth, and last point. In Genesis 22, the binding of Isaac establishes the holy place of the temple in Jerusalem, while the Quran presents Abraham and Ishmael as the founders of the holy place in Mecca, so in Surah 227. Here too, the Quranic reference seems to relate to the two stories of Hagar's escape in Genesis 16 and 21, in which Ishmael becomes a wanderer living in the desert. This helped the Quran to bring him to Mecca. The story of the good tidings is retold in Surah 15. Maureen, can you present this text? Thank you. Where the so-called visitors or guests, or in later tradition, the angels, announce to Abraham the birth of a knowing, this is a term here, a knowing son. 53. Again, without mentioning his name. Abraham expresses disbelief due to his old age. However, in the biblical story, in Genesis 18, it is Sarah, not Abraham, who reacts in disbelief to the visitor's news that she will give birth because of her old age. Therefore, Abraham Geiger believed that there was a mistake. There is a mistake in Surah 15. The story of the good news is also told in Surah 11, where the text clearly speaks about the birth of Isaac. In this version, the Quran knows quite good that Sarah, not Abraham, is the one laughing and saying, "Shall I, an old woman, bear a child while my husband is an old man?" Just like in Genesis 18. So is Geiger correct in claiming that there is a mistake in Surah 15 where Abraham, not Sarah, is depicting as laughing? Not necessarily. I suggest reading Surah 15 as a parallel enunciation to the one in Surah 11. Surah 15 tells the birth of Ishmael, not Isaac. It would then be understandable why the announcement was made to Abraham, the father of Ishmael, who was 87 years old at the time, and why he is the one who laughed, not Sarah, who was not the mother of Ishmael. Evidence indicating that the proclamation in Surah 15 refers to Ishmael can be found in the attribute given to the son as the knowing son, Alim. Excuse my pronunciation, Alim. In the Akedah story in Surah 37, if you go back, Maureen, you can show it, verse 101, the son is described as gentle, Halim. These are two different words, Alim and Halim, with the first emphasizing intellectual qualities and the second moral qualities. However, there is a sonic similarity between the two words in Arabic, Alim, Halim. Professor Meir Barasher pointed out to me that there is also a visual similarity in writing these words, raising the possibility that they could have the same characterization but copied incorrectly. This highlights a potential bias in the Quran to associate the story of Akedah with Ishmael and downplay details that support the biblical narrative, which states that Isaac was the son who was bound. If my interpretation is correct, it can be stated that just as Surah 37 includes two announcement stories, the first about Ishmael without mentioning his name, and the second about Isaac, so do the stories about Abraham's guest in Surah 15 the birth of Ishmael, and Surah 11. Both herald two births, one of Ishmael, the other of Isaac. The Quran thus presents two parallel stories of Ishmael and Isaac. And in doing so, it follows the similarity we found in the Torah itself between Genesis 21, which tells about the expulsion of Ishmael, and chapter 22, the telling about the binding of Isaac. The Quran preserved a similar duplicity to turn it on its head. The biblical story of Ishmael's expulsion becomes in the Quran a story of his binding. My interpretation is based so far on a relatively solid textual foundation, so I hope. I'm suggesting that the Quranic version was crafted through a well-thought-out interpretation of the Torah. However, it is also possible to speculate, now we came again to the speculations, that the Quran is echoing an ancient oral tradition that told a counter story of the Aqidah involving Ishmael rather than Isaac. As mentioned, remnants of such an alternative tradition can be seen in the account of Ishmael's expulsion in Genesis 21, which was given a negative spin by biblical editors to eliminate an earlier favorable version of Ishmael. It is therefore possible to reconstruct from the biblical negative account a positive counter-narrative about Ishmael as the chosen son. True, there is no clear evidence of the existence of such a narrative in any written source. However, two allusions can be found, perhaps, in the book of Jubilees. According to it, God praised Abraham for not sparing his firstborn son. Why does Jubilees refer to Isaac as the firstborn, even though Ishmael was Abraham's first son? Is it possible that Jubilees preserved an earlier tradition that the bound son was Ishmael, not the firstborn? Jubilees has another potential allusion. If the alternate story portrayed Ishmael in a favorable light, it would be reasonable to assume that it also included a version that was hostile towards Isaac. Indeed, Jubilees claim that it was Satan, not God, who instigated the test of Abraham. Could the mention of Satan be a remnant of a hostile story which viewed Abraham's willingness to sacrifice Isaac as satanic? These two deviations of Jubilees from the biblical story may testify to the existence of an oral tradition that is different from the one told in the Torah, and that continued to be transmitted long after the canonization of the Bible. This could support the theory that the Quran was aware of such an alternative oral tradition that favored Ishmael over Isaac. However, the Quran does not mention Ishmael's names, perhaps to avoid contradicting the clearly Judeo-Christian consensus. I can understand if some people would think that this hypothesis is far-fetched. However, I suggest not completely dismissing it. I hope to provide more examples in the future where the reconstruction of a biblical counter-narratives can help explain discrepancies between the Quran and the biblical story. Moreover, I'm not the first one to proposing that the Akedah story in the Quran reflects an old unknown tradition. Reuven Firestone has already suggested that in an early version of the Akedah narrative, the sacrificed son was Ishmael, not Isaac. He reached this conclusion by relying on a different methodology. He argues that it was the eldest son, Ishmael, not Isaac, who was the natural candidate for sacrifice as was common in surrounding pagan societies. According to Firestone, the biblical story of the Akedah occurred immediately after the birth of Ishmael was proclaimed in Genesis 17. After Abraham passed the test of sacrificing Ishmael, he was blessed with another son, Isaac, by his wife Sarah. Firestone and I both arrived at a similar conclusion, however, by different methodologies. Is a speculation by two historians less speculative? You decide. To conclude, my main argument is that the Quran was aware of the similarities between the expulsion of Ishmael in chapter 21 and the binding of Isaac in chapter 22. In recent decades, beginning in the 90s, biblical scholars have also recognized this similarity. During the Shabbat, when the weekly Torah portion Vayera, which includes these two stories, is read in the synagogue, preachers in many synagogues like to talk about Akedat Yitzchak versus Akedat Yishmael. However, to my knowledge, no medieval Jewish commentator recognized the parallels between the two stories. Previously, I believed that the inability of medieval commentators to see literary parallels between biblical story was due to their traditional view of the biblical text that sees only the narrative and not the narrator and his art of narration. However, the fact that the Torah reading on Rosh Hashanah includes precisely these two chapters suggests that even a traditional reading could see the thematic and literary connections between the two stories. Therefore, I would like to suggest another explanation. The reading of the Torah on Rosh Hashanah was established long before the advent of Islam and did not pose any difficulties. However, after Ishmael was presented in Islamic tradition as a beloved and sacrificed son, medieval Jewish Bible commentators chose to ignore the literary parallels between Genesis 21 and 22 to avoid confirming the Muslim claim about the Akedah of Ishmael. The silence of Jewish Bible commentators was not due to limitations in their literary understanding, as I had thought before, but rather to their decision to avoid competition with Islam over the identity of the chosen son and the holy place he founded, whether in Jerusalem or in Mecca. This observation distinguishes the Jewish-Muslim discourse. Jews and Christians agreed that the blessing was fulfilled in Isaac, while Christians claimed that this sacrifice serves as a model for Jesus' crucifixion. Jews stuck to Isaac himself and loaded him with characteristics reminiscent of Jesus. These are two parallel and similar moves. Both sides, the Christian and the Jewish, debated who the true Isaac or Israel, Verus Israel, is, whether it was to be understood literally or spiritually. Jews and Muslims, on the other hand, argued over who the chosen son is, Isaac, the father of Israel, or Ishmael. The different interpretation of the Holy Scriptures created numerous points of conflict between Jews and Christians, but the two religions also shared a common textual foundation, which sometimes intensified the debate over its interpretation. Islam, on the other side, challenged the authenticity and historicity of the Torah, making it more difficult for Jews and Muslims to find common ground and engage in dialogue on the Bible. Therefore, Jewish polemics with Christianity were more intense than those with Islam in the Middle Ages. Maimonides, a medieval Jewish philosopher and jurist, noticed these differences. In a halachic question addressed to him, he was asked whether it is permissible to teach the Torah to Christians and Muslims. His answer was that teaching the Torah to Christians is permissible, as they believe in the authenticity of the biblical text and could potentially be convinced to adopt Judaism. Teaching the Torah to Muslims, however, is forbidden, as they do not accept the veracity of the Torah. Maimonides assumed that Christians would admit misinterpretations if proven wrong, whereas Muslims would not change their beliefs when confronted with different and contradictory texts from the Torah. Maimonides' observation may be one reason why Jews in the Middle Ages felt less threatened in a Muslim environment. Maimonides highlights the importance of shared beliefs and a common text in shaping relations between religious communities. The consensus on the Hebrew Bible created a shared history between Jews and Christians, which could in fact also lead to tensions, but provided a basis for dialogue. On the other hand, Islam's denial of the validity of the Torah created a greater distance, reducing the likelihood of conflict, but reducing the possibility of dialogue. Building upon Maimonides' diagnosis, I would like to conclude my talk by briefly discussing contemporary history. I am currently speaking to you from Jerusalem, a city with a rich history of co-production between the three Abrahamic religions, which continues to this day. However, the direction of this co-production has changed. For almost 2,000 years, relations between Jews and Christians were stained, while the relationships with Muslims was relatively friendly. But today the pendulum has swung in the opposite direction. While Jews and Christians attempt to remove the shadows of the past and find more opportunities for mutual understanding and reconciliation, the hostility between Jews and Muslims is escalating. This shift began around a century ago with the rise of Zionism, which based its national ideology on the belief in biblical promises and the dream of returning to Zion. Since its inception, Zionism has received broad support in the West as it aligns with a Judeo-Christian understanding of history and the historicity of the Bible. However, Islam rejects a Jewish claim to sovereignty over the land based on the Hebrew Bible. As early as the 11th century, Muhammad ibn Hazm of Cordoba, the birthplace of Maimonides, rejected the claim that God had promised the Jews the Holy Land for eternity. He acknowledged that Jews had briefly lived there, but they were later expelled, and the land was then passed on to the Muslims as an inheritance from Allah. This position is in line with the Quran's inclination to present an alternative narrative to that of the Bible regarding the identity of the chosen son and the holy place. Today, many Palestinians deny that there was a Jewish presence in Palestine during biblical times, or that ancient Jewish temples ever stood on the Haram al-Sharif. They also reject connection of modern Jews to the biblical Israelites. In turn, many Israelis deny the Palestinian historical narrative and the fact that the Jewish settlers in modern Palestine did not arrive in an empty land. Israeli historian Professor Ben-Zion Dinur, in his introduction to the 10th volume anthology Israel in Exile, asserted that the Jewish presence in the land of Israel came to an end with the Arab conquest in the 7th century. This was recently cited by Benjamin Netanyahu. This historical claim has an internal logic. if the Arabs expelled the Jews from their land, it seems natural the Jews would have the right to reconquer it from their conquerors. However, this claim is not supported by historical evidence. In reality, it was the Muslims who allowed Jews to return and settle in Jerusalem and its surrounding areas during the 7th century, effectively lifting the centuries-old Roman and Christian ban that had prevented Jewish presence in the region. Thus, the disagreement between the two sides are not just over interpretations, but over historical facts. As mentioned, one of the main issues under debate is whether the historical story of the Bible is true. This is where Maimonides' observations takes on new significance. Should we accept his pessimistic view that only interpretations can be debated, not facts? Is the conflict between Islam and Judaism over biblical history insurmountable? I refuse to be pessimistic. I believe that our academic initiative can help construct bridges for peace seekers on both sides to cross. By studying the co-production between the three monotheistic religions in the past, we have the potential to create new avenues for reconciling conflicting historical narratives in the present and the future. I hope that this lecture is a small step in that direction. Thank you.
Thank you, Israel, for this marvelous lecture and for building the path. If the path is made by walking it, you have just done so, and we're happy to follow. Maureen Nathalie will guide the discussion. We have roughly 23 minutes. And I know that is far too little for the questions that will arise. So Maureen, I wish you good luck in this difficult task.
Thank you, Israel, for this very suggestive talk that opens so many possibilities about the recovering muted narratives. I was going to tell everyone, please use the raise your hand function in Zoom to ask a question, but everyone actually is doing that as I am talking. So I will just ask people in the order that I saw them. So please, Aisunya Thar, please ask your question.
Thank you very much, Professor Yuval, for the fascinating presentation. I would be interested in two questions. Were there a debate about the status of Ismail's mother and Isaac's mother? As you know, Ismail's mother was a slave. And I think it's interesting that the Muslim version, yes, took the slave version. Did that had an impact on the debate about slavery, or the other version of Isaac, that his mother was not a slave? That's one question. And the second question is, when I read several exegetic works, I wonder that a lot of details are in these works, I would say sometimes background information of those respective persons. And I think they have a lot of from Christian and Jewish background. In the Islamic exegesis, we have the name of Israeliyat, persons who are converted from Judaism to Islam. So for sure, they took all their background information. Do you know if this Israeliyat, people coming from the Jewish religion, taking their heritage of knowledge with them and putting it into the Islamic exegesis? That would be very interesting. And I would totally support your call for more peace in the understanding. And yes, I hope so. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your two questions. First, concerning the slavery. Well, we should remember, of course, according to the biblical story, Ishmael became involved with a kind of slavery. But don't forget that according to the prophecy given to Abraham, and which later realized, Israel itself, or the descendants of Israel, became slaves in Egypt. So this play with slavery, who is the slave and who is saved from slavery, continues to play an important role. And I think it can strengthen this hypothesis of counter narrative. So you take motifs from that you relate to the adversary side and you adopt them, but turn their meaning and reverse the meaning into a positive one. So the slavery that later will become the event so important in the history of the birth of the people of Israel is also part of the characterization of Israel, and the slavery becomes a salvation, the salvation from freedom, from slavery to freedom. Concerning the second question, I am here actually as your student. I have to learn from you because I'm a short visitor in the whole Islamic stuff, and I will appreciate to hear from you if this possibility seems to be make sense.
Thank you. I will now ask Professor Heiss to ask a question.
Thank you for this fascinating talk. So interesting, Israel. I had a quick comment and then a larger observation. The quick comment is regarding Surah 15, which I think it's possible, even though it's the visitors who come and reveal the information and Abraham laughs, it still has precedent in Genesis 17, where Abraham is first told by God, no, it's going to be Sarah, not Hagar. The child will be circumcised on the 8th day. And he mocks. It says, Vayitzchak, he laughs or he mocks the idea and says, can Sarah bear a child at 90? Of course not. And then he realizes God is serious. And he says, Lu Yishmael yichye lefanecha, that Yishmael could be the one, could live in your sight. So maybe we have a conflation going on in Surah 15. That's a possibility, I suggest to you, of those two mocking moments, one of Abraham's and one of Sarah's, and they've conflated it for Abraham, which would suggest that the Quran, and many other scholars have suggested this, isn't actually oriented towards the biblical text, but is oriented towards midrashim and traditions in the Jewish and Christian community, oral versions of the biblical text. So that might impact the way you look at this. And then the second observation I have, I'll try to be brief, is that I love this idea of counter narratives, and I do think history is just a stratigraphy of counter narratives and counter narratives. What's fascinating to me, though, is that the biblical text seems to give credence to the counter narrative that it's countering, to the narrative that it's countering for basically 11 chapters, starting in chapter 11, where we first get the genealogy that says Sarai is barren. Abraham is then promised he'll be the father of great nations. Anyone who doesn't know the end of the story would think, well, it's not going to be through Sarai. And immediately he goes to Egypt and tries to get rid of her and passes her off. He doesn't think it's her, she's barren. And then when she gives him the opportunity to have Hagar be a surrogate mother, he takes it. A child is born, and Hagar is then told that she will have numerous offspring that will be counted like the stars, just as Abraham was told. So we as innocent readers think it's Ishmael. And then only in Genesis 17 does God show up and say, no, sorry, let me be clear, this child will be circumcised on the 8th day. At this point, he's 13. We're told he's 99 now. So it's going to be through Sarah. And he laughs, he mocks, he doesn't believe it. And he says, it can't be. Let Ishmael be the one. God says, no, it's Sarah. He rushes out and he circumcises Ishmael to try to grandfather him in. And then he doesn't even tell Sarai. She has to learn it from 3 visitors who show up at her tent. So he didn't even tell her. And she mocks and laughs. She doesn't believe it. And then they go to Gerar and he passes her off again. He doesn't believe it's her. He has all his money on Ishmael. And if you read it that way, then when we get to Genesis 22 and God says, sacrifice Isaac, he might be thinking, maybe God has come around to my way of thinking and it'll be Ishmael. And then we find out that's not the case. But for 11 chapters, we've been backing the wrong horse with Abraham. And that's a lot of airtime to give to a narrative that you're countering. And also the fact that Abraham is so subversive, I wonder if that's why both Christians, Jews, all of Christians, Jews, and Muslims have had to create a counter narrative to the Bible to make him a man of absolute and utter faith, when he in fact is the most faithless patriarch and has to have it forced on him over 11 chapters.
Thank you so much for your observation. I fully agree with you. I would just make two comments. First of all, I mentioned Toldot Yeshu, which is for many, I mean, for my generation, is I think the first time that we encountered this concept of counter narrative. Toldot Yeshu is a book, is a text, a long text, which time and again tell all the details of the gospel and repeat them in a reversed meaning. So the art of telling a counter narrative can be very sophisticated, can be very developed. And I fully agree with you. Once you adopt actually the concept of counter narratives, and actually this is my dream, to write a counter narrative to the book of Genesis. And I already published an article, unfortunately, only in Hebrew, of 45 pages, only discussing counter narratives in the story of Genesis concerning Abraham. And my future dream is also to write something like that concerning the New Testament. And now this is a short visit in the Quran, because I think once you accept this methodology, you have many opportunities, but I admit I also risk to be banned and from the scholarly community by speculating too much. So I made an attempt here in this closed circle to see if this may be accepted not only by literature scholars of literature, but also by historians. But I fully agree with you that the whole book of Genesis is full with possibilities, sometimes very subversive, very speculative, and very, you have to perhaps really to employ not only textual acquaintance with the text, but also our imagination. Yes, please.
Yeah, so Abdullah Galadari, please.
Well, thank you so much for this wonderful talk. I really enjoyed it. I have one small comment and one question. The comment is basically the passage in chapter 37, where you basically showed that the glad tidings is given, of course, twice. Just as a comment, besides the glad tidings, there's also the request of a righteous offspring, which happens also in the beginning of the narrative. And Isaac is also basically said that, the Quran actually says that he's also from among the righteous. So we also see that parallelism in there. But that's just a small comment. My question is this: the Quran never shied away from contentions between the Jewish community and the Quranic community about many different aspects. But it never shows anywhere, whether from the Quran or even from the earliest Muslim tradition, like the sayings of Muhammad and things like that, that there was ever a contention about who was the person to be sacrificed by Abraham. So why would you think there is this kind of a gap?
I think I gave a short reference to this question by claiming that maybe it's only a possibility, a suggestion, that the Quran didn't want to face or to contradict such a fundamental tradition which is shared among Jews and Christians. So in the heart, he had the wish or the feeling or the comment, the possibilities of his interpretation, of the interpretation to explain, to understand it as a story about Ishmael, but didn't want to be specific, didn't want to name. And my explanation is perhaps that in the common opinion was so well based and fundamental that the story is about Isaac, that it was an attempt to doubt or to raise, to live in ambiguity, perhaps this is the word, to leave it in ambiguity and to raise possible interpretations in the future. But this is of course, only an explanation why in the story the name is not mentioned.
David Nirenberg, please go.
Yes, thank you. And I think my question follows on Abdullah Galadari's, although I will pose it in a less coherent way. Well, first, a comment. I very much admire your literary analysis. I do wonder if the literary is, in your analysis, looks very much like the political, in the sense that we can imagine many literatures that are not all about contests over land, and yet you have reduced each one of them, beginning with the Canaanites all the way to the present, to basically political contests. But that's just a general comment about the nature of the literary. Following on Abdullah, I wonder if we're not missing yet another aspect of co-production, but it strikes me, and I'm like you, an interloper in this area, but it strikes me that Ishmael is not very important in Quranic at all, actually, in Quranic genealogies or in early Islamic genealogies until a bit later than this period. So this is not really an issue that is central to the earliest debates. It becomes very central in things like Ibn Qutayba and others. It becomes very central when there is an attempt to create genealogies for the prophet and to create claims for Arab supremacy over conquered peoples. But that's a slightly later than the Quranic redaction itself. So perhaps one reason to explain the gap that Abdullah Galadari has pointed to has more to do with the fact that it wasn't necessary to weaponize Ishmael in this way until there were these other contests that were more internal to the Islamic community than they were focused on the Isaac-Ishmael duality.
Well, it goes in the same direction. In fact, first, Ishmael is not central, but still he is the founder of Mecca, which is still an important fact. I mean, creating the new holy site. But if Ishmael is not central and becomes central in the future, it goes in line with what I've just said to Abdullah, that maybe the Quran was still hesitant with raising the alternative, with proposing an alternative story. It created the basis, created the seeds that will later develop, and the political context was perhaps not so important also in the beginning. Concerning the political context, also in the biblical story, it is not necessarily always political. I mean, it could be have different directions. In the article that I mentioned, which I tried to claim, for instance, a completely different approach to the Akedah, to the story of the Akedah, in an internal approach, that the counter narrative of the Akedah was not necessarily coming from people who had a political claim on the land. It could come, for instance, the story could be interpreted as a criticism against Abram, the fact that he was ready to slaughter his son. So there are many possibilities. I said also in my response, previous response, that may explain the distortions or the way the text is running to many different alternatives. So, of course, since it is open to speculations, there are no limits. I think the limit that I would try to impose are the limits of the reasonability. To what extent these counter narratives have any purpose, have any basis in the text itself. To what extent they can be based on remnants in the story, to facts that are not very easily comprehensible, and which attest perhaps the possibility that the text includes elements that were not removed, was not edited out by the editor of the text. But I agree with you. There are many possibilities. I do not pretend to explain the logic or the politics, definitely, certainly not of the Quran, to what extent Ishmael is important, why it is not as important as we would expect. And don't forget that he is, even according to my speculation, his name is not given in Surah 37. So this is already says something about the scopes or the limitation of the explanation who is the bound son here.
Shlomo, you also had a question?
Yes, and this is Shlomo Zukir. Apologies, I have all sorts of technical difficulties today. But Yisrael, I really enjoyed the talk. Thank you very much. And just one note, you discussed the prayer on Rosh Hashanah, the Musaf, the additional prayer on Rosh Hashanah, and pointed to how dating the binding of Isaac to that date, or at least referring to it on that date, participates in this questions, in these polemics. Just a couple additional notes on that. One is the passage you read about how just like Abraham overcame his mercy, God, you should overcome your anger. The end of that line talks about how Isaac should be remembered among his descendants, and there's different textual versions. Some versions say among the descendants of Jacob, and some just say Isaac's descendants, and that, of course, is to rule out Esau as a possible inheritor of Isaac, and Esau standing in for Edom, for Rome, for Christianity. So I think it's interesting there that you can read that prayer about the binding of Isaac on Rosh Hashanah is both about ruling out Ishmael and also ruling out Esau as an inheritor of Isaac and ultimately of Abraham. And I wonder if it's part of the reason why you find that such a focus on specifying who properly inherits Abraham and Isaac, obviously the protagonists of that story, is in that prayer in particular, the Musaf of Rosh Hashanah. It emphasizes all sorts of universalistic aspects of God. God as creator of the world, God as redeeming or remembering the world through Noah, which saved all of humanity. And maybe there's an extra need to lean in on, in a mode of compensation, to lean in on more particularistic, the particularistic question of who properly inherits Abraham and Isaac. So I'm curious if you have thoughts on that reading and on that understanding of that prayer, the Rosh Hashanah prayer overall.
Well, your question touched a very delicate problem. I think we encounter this ambiguity very often when sometimes you find in Jewish text a kind of confrontation with an alternative religion, and sometimes a kind of adoption. And what you mentioned concerning the version about Jacob is a good example, because from one hand side, as I claimed, the adoption of Isaac as a redemptive, actually, an atonement, the sacrifice of Isaac is an atonement in relation to Rosh Hashanah. I claim that this has some similarities with Christianity, but on the other side, there is also a kind of reservation and an attempt to rule out the competition with Esau. I think the two opposing lines fit the truth. I mean, there are two opposing tendencies. Concerning the universal aspects of the prayer for Rosh Hashanah, this is a very complicated topic. I'm dealing with it in a completely different context right now. I think we should be careful in putting all the prayers together. There are certainly different motifs, contradictory motifs. You are perfectly right, there are very universal elements in the prayer, but there are also very particularistic I tend to believe that the difference is also a difference of timing, of the time of the composition, but this is a complicated topic. But this is a very broad issue that I cannot refer right now, but I agree with you that the prayer also contains universal elements and not only direct relations vis-a-vis Esau as representative of Christianity and Ishmael as representative of Islam.
So we have about 30 seconds left in our session. So if Israel is okay, we can have one last very short question by Paul, if he feels up to the task.
Yeah, thank you. That's yeah, well, challenge accepted, I guess. So thank you very much, Israel Yuval, for this fascinating talk. It's not really a question, it's more of a comment, actually, because I was rereading this Quranic passage. I was actually struck by two elements, and especially by this thing that the Quran actually does very often, which is that it uses kind of prototypical figures. And so I was wondering, because I was struck while reading this, this Quranic verse, by the use of the expression the clear test to describe how, I mean, what Abraham is facing with having to kill his son, whoever he was. And so this expression, al-bala al-mubin in Arabic, I looked and it's actually used only in 5 other places in the Quran, 4 of which are actually in relation to Pharaoh's order to kill all the Hebrew boys. Which of course is based on Exodus 1:15 to 16. And so so that was like the first kind of prototypical thing. I was wondering maybe if there was, well, there quite obviously seems to be a relationship between those two sacrifices or those 2 killings of boys. And then there was also the use of the verb, which we alluded to already, of the verb bashara, to give the good news, which in the Quran is used only in the case of 3 people, well, to announce the good news of the birth of 3 people who are, well, apart from Isaac or Ishmael, which is used in the case of John the Baptist and of Jesus, who are also 2 figures who are going to be sacrificed, who are going to die for the greater good, I guess we could say. So I just wanted to point out those possible relations between those expressions and verbs. And thank you very much again.
So a short question and even shorter my comment. Thank you for the 2 comments, actually. I will try to learn from it, and I thank you all for your participation.
Thank you very much once again, Israel. I feel like everyone much enjoyed your talk. So thank you very much for all your suggestive insights. And I think we will end there.
Thank you.
Thank you.